Hi all, let's have a look at the Armageddon game that occurred between Magnus Carlsen and Vishy Anand in round 1. So the Armageddon game, white has 10 minutes to black 7. There's a 3-second increment from move 61. So very interesting. Often faster time controls favour Magnus Carlsen, so perhaps he becomes the favourite after the classical game, which ended up in a draw. Let's see. So what happened? C4 for Magnus, and Vishy plays E5. So English opening, knight C3, bishop B4, and now knight D5 hitting that bishop. The bishop goes to E7. You might think bishop C5 looks quite tempting. It turns out here actually white does okay with the move knight F3, positively inviting E4. So often D6 is played because E4 is not that good. It turns out here knight G5, very tactical, because the queen's holding C7 at the moment. And if queen takes, then knight takes C7 check, and D4 is strong. And that rook remains trapped, so after this sequence, white ends up actually better, and there can be a rescue plan for the knight like this with a big advantage. So that's the kind of thing where bishop C5 might not be that great. So if black does better to play D6, white ends up with a small edge anyway, like this, for example. Some interesting lines. I thought I'd check it out from a theoretical perspective. But bishop E7 was played. D4 now, E takes. Queen takes D4, so looking at G7, knight F6. And white does take the time to take out that bishop and now pin this knight. We have knight C6 hitting the queen. The queen drops back. Now knight E5 is played. On queen B4, the structural damage surely will give white a small edge. If we have a look at this, it looks fairly pleasant for white. So here, knight E5, knight F3, D6. On knight takes F3 check, G takes is probably the idea. For example, like this, white can end up with a very nice position, small edge. So D6, E3, H6, bishop H4, G5 is played. Quite forcing. Knight takes E5. And it's here actually, from a technical point of view, the engines seem to like in this position not taking either piece, but instead, from an engine point of view, knight E4 is interesting. So for example, this sequence where the queen and rook are hit could end up with this kind of position where black seems to be okay just about. White has structural damage here. There's a bit of a bind on position, active H file for black. That might have been, in theory, the best way to play the position. But Vishy played D takes here. On G takes as an alternative, then the knight going back, this G file might not be that much for black. White could end up with a nice position like this, but it could still be okay for black as well. So knight takes, we have D takes though, bishop G3, knight D7, H4. It seems as though white has got something from the opening, especially after Magnus's next move here, which is C5. So it creates a kind of bind on the position and marking the potentially sensitive D6 square. If this pawn ever moves, D6 is a nice outpost square potentially. We have H5 being played. On knight takes C5, that weakens E5. White could take there, and if castling this kind of thing with bishop G7 to pick up H6, threatening mate, will end up white having a big advantage. So yeah, it seems undesirable to do that. Knight takes C5, and on queen takes, it also seems undesirable, this position after bishop takes C7. So white would obviously be better there. So we have H5, rook C1 supporting that C5, pawn C6. This does emphasize that D6 could be an issue for black. Bishop D3, black castles, white castles now. Rook E8, rook FD1, knight F6. The bishop drops back. So it looks like a classic use potentially of this diagonal if ever the queen joins the bishop, to at least try and tempt the pawn forward, which would extend the scope of this bishop. We see knight D5, and in fact this happens now. Queen C2, threatening to come into H7. So Vishy plays E4, which makes this bishop better, and looking at d6 now, we see rook d4, so putting pressure on e4 immediately, preparing to double rooks and controlling b4 as well. So f5, a3, which means actually bishop a2 later is going to be possible. Bishop e6, the rooks double, rook ad1, bishop a2, so quite a bit of pressure building up on d5. Rook d7, now b4, trying to undermine black's d5 with an a4 b5 plan potentially. a6, and in fact a4 is played. We see here rook ed8. Yes, it's not really possible to take on b4. Rook takes d7, that looks crushing as an example. So rook d8, we have b5, a takes, and now knight f6. On c takes b5, there's a tactical disaster. White would play, after that's loosened, white could play here bishop d6, disconnecting black from d5, winning material at least. For example, like this, there's nothing for black here. It's not enough. The queen by herself. So that would be a disaster line after bishop d6. Also, even bishop takes d5 is good though, with bishop d6 later. So this position is good for white as well, but the other way is bigger advantage. So knight f6, black dare not basically weaken d5 there. Rook d6, nice outpost square with lateral pressure now building up. Bishop takes, queen takes, check. And now queen a5. So looking at things like queen takes d8 check, potentially, as a threat now to get two rooks for a queen. Rook takes d6 is played. On rook e8, then white could take here and play queen a6, hitting c6. This is a very dominating position indeed, with a big advantage for white. So rook takes d6, c takes, queen d7, b takes. The queen has to protect d8 here. So b takes, rook b1, rook f8, queen c7. Yeah, this pawn is being driven forward, or c6 will drop. It's very nasty looking. Rook f7, check, and now bishop e5. White is making inroads here, putting a lot more pressure on black's position. Knight d5, and now there's a common square h8, which Magnus Carlsen uses. Rook h8 check. And here, queen b8, knight f6. We have bishop takes f6. And this is devastating for black's king now. King takes f6 was played. If rook takes f6, white could actually play check, and now d7 is really strong. Nothing stopping that pawn queening off the check here. That pawn's going to queen. So very difficult. So we have king takes f6, check here, rook h6. So if king g7, there's queen h8 checkmate, king e5. And now, in fact, the fastest route to mate is queen b2 check. So, for example, like this, Magnus plays another way, queen h8, which is winning anyway, and the game ended here. Vishy had to resign. If rook g7, then rook g6 is winning that material with that horrible pin. For example, like this is crushing. So I'll take you back to the final possession, queen h8 check. So I thought it was quite an interesting game, but of course it's not a classical game. In fact, there have been some critics of this tournament. Why are they putting these rapid games in them? Well, for me, it fits me, it aligns with me and this channel, because I like to cover really decisive games. I don't like to cover endless draws all the time. So I'm kind of happy that there is this possibility of looking at decisive games, but of course the game quality overall is lower. The players don't have that much time to think about their moves. It's more driven by intuition than concrete calculation. Vishy, of course, has been fantastic at rapid throughout his career as well. It's just that Magnus is a bit better at the moment on the faster time controls than anyone. But certainly Vishy is superb usually at faster time controls relative to other grandmasters as well. So yeah, it's interesting also to extend theoretical knowledge from such games anyway. I like to ask questions in the opening, you know, what are these variations, to be able to touch on them. So I still think it's insightful for everyone to check over these in some way. And so I hope you found this game interesting. And let's see. If you enjoyed the game, then please click on the top left box, which should appear shortly. Become a member at chessbowl.net, play against other YouTubers. You can also test yourself on variations covered in this and other games from the improved menu at chessworld.net, the puzzle books option, which has a link to the annotated game. Comments, questions, donations, see the description. Like, share, subscribe with the notification bell. Really appreciated. Thanks very much. Let's have a quick look at the puzzle book for this game. So this is the improved menu at chessworld.net. So puzzle books. So let's do one or two from this. So white play here for a clear advantage. I think it was taking here, and then bishop takes hits the rook and c7. Okay, here bishop d6 is a killer move, interrupting black's d5. But also, sorry, there was another variation with bishop takes d5 then, with bishop d6 here. There were two ways to do that. In this position, rook takes d5, no? What was the point here? Ah. Okay, that's interesting. Queen d2. All right. Forcing, okay, this brings into clarity things. Yeah, forcing black to take. That opens up the queen on this diagonal. I see, yeah, that's a very interesting, yeah, to get more clarity on what we covered there. Okay, but here, this was the line with bishop d6 immediately. Yeah, we're just winning material here. Now, in this position, b takes is possible with the idea of queen a6 hitting c6. Let me just snap off on c6. That's enough for a big advantage, of course. Now here, the rook would be hanging weakness for the last move. Okay, yeah, it's just making puzzles out of variations, and sometimes it adds clarity. So I hope you check that out. But also of great interest on the puzzle book section is the famous players. And so, for example, you can have a look at Fischer. The Fischer puzzle book in particular is really a lot of fun. It's got 172 and strong game finishes. Okay, hope you check that out. Thanks very much.